Turn to the book of Genesis, and we're going to start in chapter 42. Recall, we're looking at the topic or the doctrine of affliction. Affliction. And we're concentrating right now on how afflictions are made beneficial. And we're going to look at some examples in the Bible and in the Old Testament of how afflictions made things better. You say, well, that doesn't make sense. How is something bad happening to you make things better? Well, when the Lord deals with us as with His children, we'll always be better off when He deals with us. So think about that, and let's look in Genesis 42 and go down to verse number 21. And this is Joseph saying, you bring your brother Benjamin down here, and we'll see if you're telling the truth or not. And they said one to another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul, when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. So they have borne that guilt of selling their brother Joseph into slavery. And they're feeling guilty about it. But yet they did it anyway, didn't they? For years it had gone over now. And then finally Joseph has a means of helping his family, and he's trying to do it without them knowing who he is until the right time. So his brothers are being afflicted, but what was the end result of his brothers going down to Egypt to get corn? Ultimately, it was for their benefit, because they would bring their daddy and all the rest of their family down to Egypt. So recall that God sometimes has to move us out of a place that's dry into a place that's prosperous. And then remember, God had already promised Abraham that his children would go down into Egypt, and they would sojourn there for 400 years. And that's how long they stayed down in Egypt, until finally Moses was brought up and delivered them through the power of God. So those afflictions were made beneficial to his brethren. But now look, if you will, over at Genesis 50. Look what Joseph says. In verse number 20. Genesis 50 and verse 20. Now think about Joseph. Here he was, his daddy's favorite, and his brothers were extremely jealous. And what did his brothers ultimately do to him? They were about to kill him. And instead of killing him, they had put him in a pit to decide how they're going to kill him. And they came up with a plan how they're going to kill him. And then ultimately, through the providence of God, here comes a camel train, a caravan that was going to Egypt and selling slaves, etc. And it was just by chance, right, that caravan came by at the right time. No. God's providence saw to it that Joseph was not slain, but that he was sold into slavery. And why was he sold into slavery? So that ultimately he could take care of not only Egypt, but also who? Israel, his whole family. And look what he says in verse 20. But as for you, ye thought evil against me. And how true that was. They had deliberately said, let's kill him. It was in their heart to kill him, until one of them talked him into trading him and getting money so that they could go have a party with his money for selling him into slavery. But look what he says, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Had it not been for God, meaning good, Israel would have perished in that drought. and many Egyptians. Egypt would probably be just about as bad being destroyed by that drought had they not been prepared by the grace of God and had not been afflicted at the right way at the right time. Many would have died. But notice what Joseph says, God meant it for good. Now you think about it, how would Joseph feel being down there in Egypt, sold as a slave, bought by Potiphar, and then accused of molesting Potiphar's wife and cast into prison? Now that's pretty low. Here you are a slave, and now you're in prison as well. Now Joseph could have gotten bitter right then. But God used him even in prison to begin to do the work of a prophet or a dreamer, as it were. He had already been working with Joseph about dreams of things to come. And Joseph used those dreams, and ultimately that got him to be second in command in Egypt. So God took those afflictions that Joseph was going through, those circumstances, and made them into the part where he became second in command in Egypt. So much so that he had the decision of life and death over all those that came into Egypt, and he could have ordered right then, as soon as his brother showed up, he could have said, off with their heads, and they'd have been dead like that. But instead, he had compassion for his brothers, especially his father, because he knew that if he killed those brothers, that his father would die from that heartache, because he almost died from the heartache of losing Joseph. They had lied to Joseph, remember, or to Israel, and said, wait a minute, some wild beast has caught him, and here's his coat, and here's his blood. This is all we found left of him. See, they lied to him and thought Israel had been mourning the death of Joseph. But now, all of a sudden, his son turns up, and what's that look to his brothers, to Israel? What does he see? They all lied to him. They all treated him wrong. They all had allowed him to think his son had been dead for years. And here he was actually alive. So God turned these afflictions of the brethren and Joseph into something good to save much people alive. Now go, if you will, over to Deuteronomy, chapter number 8. Deuteronomy, chapter number 8. And look at verse 3 through 5. He says, and he humbled thee, speaking of God humbling Israel, and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with what? Manna. In other words, after the removal, he allowed them to get hungry to see what they were going to do. Now, what did they do? They murmured and complained and said, oh, that we were back in Egypt, eating onions and leeks and garlics. Wow. Here they are, just not even a year into their journey, just a few short days. They're out in the wilderness. They get hungry and say, man, what we're going to eat? He humbled them. But notice what he says. He fed thee with manna which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread alone only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. Now think about this. God says, you might have been hungry, but guess who's looking out for you? All that had to happen was God speak, and they would have been fed. And that manna is an example of that, how God can take an affliction and make it beneficial. Now think about that manna. When it started coming down, the only time that manna stopped was when they were eating quail till they were sick of quail, because they're complaining about manna. But the manna kept right up until they crossed over Jordan with Joshua. Imagine feeding that group of people that amount of food every single day. That's a lot of manna. And yet God had it coming all the way, those 40 years, that whole 40 years, they had manna. Right up until they crossed into the Jordan, over the Jordan, and into the Canaan land, where they ate from the land of milk and honey and no longer had need of manna. That's when it stopped. So God was taking care of them. And look at verse 4. Thy raiment waxed not old upon thee, neither did thy foot swell these 40 years. Thou shalt also consider in thy heart that as a man chasteneth his son, so the Lord thy God does what? Chasteneth thee. God's going to chasten them like a father would a son, because he loves them. And the only way to correct a son that's not behaving is to chasten him. And sometimes God had to chasten them quite frequently. Just like ourselves when we're growing up. Mom didn't just whoop us once and say, all right, you're good for the rest of your life. How long did she whoop us? Until we got big enough where she couldn't whoop us. But she could know how to get a hold of us anyway. But the point is that our beloved Father, our Heavenly Father, loves us enough to chastise us, to afflict us, to improve us, and to help us to be better. Now go over, if you will, to 2 Chronicles chapter 32. 2 Chronicles chapter 32. And go, if you will, down to verse number, let's start in verse 24. And in those days, Hezekiah was sick. Now notice the phrase, to what? That means what? He was dying. Plain and simple. He was sick enough to be dying. And prayed unto the Lord, and he spake unto him, and he gave him a sign. In other words, while he was praying, God spoke to him and gave him a sign. But Hezekiah rendered not again according to the benefit done unto him, for his heart was lifted up, and therefore there was wrath upon him and upon Judah and Jerusalem. Notwithstanding, Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, both he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord came not upon them in the days of Hezekiah. So you see, God spared Hezekiah that death. But Hezekiah got lifted up with pride and started showing off the enemy all of his treasures. So what ended up happening? Ended up getting his treasures taken. If you look at that, Hezekiah showed all these things, and Hezekiah ended up dying, and then Manasseh, his son, took over. All right, his son, though, if you think about it, look how old his son was down there in chapter 33. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years. He reigned from the time he was 12. But he didn't do well. Look what it says about him, verse 2. But did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. So Hezekiah didn't set a very good example for his son. But we do know that God spared Hezekiah that sickness and said, you're going to live. But then he got lifted up with pride. But then he repented, so God allowed him to die a peaceful death. And then after that, he took action like he promised he was going to do. So Hezekiah learned that the afflictions he was going through, that sickness, ended up being a blessing to him. But he wasn't very careful about that blessing. He got lifted up with pride and said, ha, 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 look at me. God spared me. I can do whatever I want. No, it cost him after he went to the grave. And then let's look at one more example. Look at Jonah. Everybody remember Jonah? Good old Jonah. We heard those stories. We've read the book of Jonah. We've studied about Jonah in Bible school. And we see that Jonah was a strong-willed man, wasn't he? He didn't want to go to Nineveh. Why? He didn't like them. They were the enemy of Israel. They were causing problems for Israel. And he knew that if he went and preached, God might actually move among them. He didn't want that. So instead of going where God told him to go, what did he do? He ran in the opposite direction, spent good money on a ticket for a boat ride, and ended up losing about half his money because he got cast out into the ocean about halfway out. So here's Jonah now blowing bubbles in the ocean, and what happens? Big old fish waiting right there when he got chunked up and swallowed him. All right, now look at chapter number 2. And look what Jonah does there in verse 1. Then Jonah did what? Prayed unto the Lord his God where? That means he's still alive, right? He ain't dead. Fish hadn't chomped him into pieces. That kind of fish couldn't do it anyway. But he's there in that fish's belly, and what does he do? He finally said, whoa, wait a minute. Time out. I'm in the wrong. Let's get things right. And he prayed unto the Lord and said, I cried by reason of my what? Affliction unto thee, unto the Lord, and he heard me. Out of the belly of hell cried I, and thou heardst my voice. For thou hast cast me into the deep, in the midst of the seas, and the floods compassed me about. All thy billows and thy waves passed over me. Then I said, I am cast out of thy sight. And notice what he says, yet I will look again toward thy holy temple. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. The depth closed me round about, till the weeds were wrapped around my head, about my head. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about me forever. Yet hast thou brought up my life from corruption, O Lord my God. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came unto thee into thy holy temple. Now notice what Jonah is saying. I had to repent, and I finally remembered who I should be praying to. So God took the affliction that Jonah was going through and used it to do what? Get Jonah back on the right path. See, Jonah had gone the wrong path, had fled from what he was supposed to do, and God had to correct him and had prepared. As a matter of fact, you think about it, God already had that fish prepared for Jonah way long before Jonah had gone on that vacation voyage. Stop and think about it. It takes a fish, a whale, a while to develop to be big enough to swallow a man. And think about this. Whales can't normally swallow men. Their gills inside of their throat prevent that. But God allowed that one whale to be made where it could swallow him, and did. And that whale happened to be right there in the ocean at the exact right time when Jonah got chunked out of that boat. That's no accident, is it? That's called the providence of God in preparing that fish from the time it was born to the time it was mature and ready to receive Jonah into his mouth and down into his belly. Now think about how dark and stinky and smelly and just, seawater around you 24/7 for 3 days. That's a lot. No light, just old fish guts all around you, stinky, seaweed wrapped around his head and his ankles and his body. And man, you can imagine how miserable he was. So he was being afflicted, but it was self-infliction, wasn't it? Remember, he had caused this to happen upon him. But God used it to get him tuned up and ready to go back and do what he was supposed to start with. And then look at chapter 3. It says, and the word of the Lord came unto Jonah the second time, saying, arise, go into Nineveh, that great city, and preach unto it the preaching that I bid thee. So Jonah arose and went up to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city of 3 days' journey, and Jonah began to enter into the city. How long? Weren't no fooling around that time, was there? A 3-day trip in 1 day, that's pretty fast. Now what does that tell you? When Jonah hit the ground, he hit the ground running. He got business done. He still needed some fine-tuning, though. There's still some stuff here that Jonah has to deal with. But like any Christian, God has to fine-tune us sometimes. Just because Jonah's a preacher doesn't mean he don't get fine-tuning. We get fine-tuning just as much as y'all do. But God says that whale was prepared. That whale's environment wasn't suitable for Jonah for those 3 days and 3 nights. And that brought him to his knees. God uses affliction to humble us, to bring us to our knees to where we'll start looking back to Him. So we'll start looking up. Sometimes you have to get down to the lowest part before you'll begin looking up again. So Jonah is a good example of affliction. And now let's look at the other side of the coin, how that about the afflictions of the wicked. Go back to Exodus 14. Exodus 14. And go down to verse number 4. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that he shall follow after them, and I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his hosts, that the Egyptians may know that what? Now what's he saying? Pharaoh's going to turn them loose, but what's he going to do? He's going to follow after them. Recall the scene there at the Great Red Sea. Now y'all remember Charlton Heston and all that stuff. Don't believe me in that movie nonsense, but this Red Sea is indeed a historical event that happened. Israel got trapped against that sea. And the only way that they could escape from Pharaoh's army, which was coming up fast upon them, was for that sea to part and for Moses to walk them across on dry ground to the other side. That was one of those miracles. The second miracle is that cloud that was following them by day hindered Pharaoh's chariots to the right time, where he said, all right, lift the cloud, and here comes the chariots. And that man, we see them, we're going after them. And what happened after the last Israelite got across that sea? Here's Pharaoh about halfway across, and what happens? Whoosh. You see, Israel, even though they were under the hand of God, even though they were going through this escape, here comes this Pharaoh's army. And boy, look what happened to them. He said, I want the whole world to see, Egypt especially, that I'm in charge, not them. That their gods are nothing, but I'm in charge. See, Egypt had a god for just about everything, like a lot of the countries do nowadays. And those gods cannot hinder, cannot do anything against the Lord God that we serve. You see, our God is sovereign over all. As we read, He is the God of gods. He is the King of kings. He is the Lord of lords. If there were any other gods, He's the God of them, which means what? They would depend upon Him for power. But He's not sharing His power, His glory with any false god. So Pharaoh's hardening his heart, but that's to show God's glory to Israel and to Egypt as well. So God would be glorified in that affliction. Now look at Psalm 37. Psalm 37. And go down to verse number 13. Psalm 37, verse number 13, and this is speaking about the wicked from verse 12. The Lord shall laugh at him, for he seeth that his day is what? What's that mean? Well, the wicked make a lot of boasts about what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, how long they're going to live, all these things. You look at the world today and look at all the things they're bragging about what they're going to do. They make their boasts. Like this crowd, our politicians in Washington say, oh, we're going to do this. This is what we're going to do. And the other world leaders say, oh, we're going to do this. And then there's Putin saying, I'm doing this. So you get all these people saying, this is what we're going to do. And what does God say? This is what I'm going to do. See, God's still in control. People have forgotten that. God's still sovereign. God's still in charge. God still sits on his throne, and he still reigns. And what he says and what he has planned and what he has chosen to do will be carried out in the hearts of men. Remember that? Proverbs 21, it says, the king's heart is in his hand, and he turneth it like a river whithersoever he will. God can turn a king's heart. God can turn a river. God can turn us. He can afflict us, but he can also hold the lost in derision. Look at Proverbs chapter 1. Same idea. Proverbs 1 and go down to verse number 26. Proverbs 1, verse 26. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as a desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind. When distress and anguish cometh upon you, then shall they call upon me. But notice what he says, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. Look at verse 29. Why? For that they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would none of my counsel. They despised all my proof. Therefore shall they eat of the fruit of what? Look at that. Their own way. They're going to suffer from their own choices. They're going to eat the fruit of their wickedness, and they're going to suffer for it. So here it is. God says, I'm going to hold you in derision. I'm going to laugh. I'm going to mock you because you chose that way among your own selves. You decided that's what you were going to do. And look what it has brought you. Look where your wisdom has brought you. Look how it's brought you to destruction. And then I want you to see one more thing this morning. Look at Deuteronomy, if you will, chapter 31. Deuteronomy chapter 31. And look down to verse number 17. This is speaking about Israel going after other gods, which God is warning Moses, they're going to do this. Verse 17, then mine anger shall be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them. I will hide my face from them, and they shall be what? Devoured. And many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they will say in their day, are not these evils come upon us because our God is not among us? And I will surely hide my face in that day for all the evils which they shall have wrought, and that they are turned unto other gods. Now here's Moses and God having a conversation way before they're in the promised land, way before they're all occupied by Joshua, and Joshua distributes the land and they run everybody out. Long before that even happens, here's God telling Moses what's going to happen. Moses, they're going to start serving other gods. You see, our God knows what's going to happen. Their gods don't know anything. They can't speak, they can't hear, they can't talk, they can't walk. They can't do anything. They can't protect themselves. They can't protect their priests and their followers. But our God knows what's going to happen. And he says, I will surely hide my face in that day. When they start turning to other gods, your afflictions will be multiplied. I want you to see that. And then one more verse about that. Psalm 32. Psalm 32. And verse 10. Many sorrows shall be to the who? The wicked. But he that trusteth in the Lord, mercy shall what? What's that mean? Yeah, it's going to encircle us. Hedge us in. Put us in that hedge of grace. Remember Job? He was hedged in until God lifted that hedge and allowed the devil into his camp. He was hedged in by grace, and that's exactly how his people are. We're all hedged in by grace, and God only allows things in to help us. But notice this says, many sorrows shall be to who? The wicked. Afflictions are going to be multiplied to the wicked. So think about that, and we'll take up with that idea next time, Lord willing, about afflictions that happen to the wicked. All right, we'll stop there. Let's all stand.